Hi, Sean. How are you today?
Great. How are you, Tiff?
I'm good. I'm really excited to dive in today on this blog post. And I'm not gonna lie, I'm a little bit nervous because you are, in my eyes, a pro at writing. I mean, you're an expert at writing, and so I'm really excited to dive into this with you from that perspective, but also to just even having a conversation around separating the data and presentation layers. I know we've been having a lot of conversations behind the scenes about it, so I'm looking forward to diving in around it.
Yeah, me too. And it's we've talked with Joe behind the scenes a lot. Most of these ideas really came from his brain, but I've been thinking about similar problems for a long time. So I'm excited to see what you've got.
It's very interesting. You know, before we even go through what I have as far as the structure of the doc, maybe a good place to start, I think that would kind of start the conversation or get it going in the right direction and let me know your thoughts. But is maybe we'll start with I have down here an example. Like I didn't spec out the example. I know we were speaking yesterday about some examples, but
Mhm.
maybe a good place to start is talking about a real world scenario or an example where what we are speaking about today would come into play. What do you think?
Sure. Yeah, that sounds good because I think there's a few different examples we could use, and I know we talked about use cases being a part of this. But yeah, that seems like a good place to start.
So I'll walk you through what I have right now. I know when we were going through it with Joe, we got pretty detailed about, actual companies, but for this, keeping it more so company X or whatever we want to call
Mhm.
company, whatever it is. So essentially kind of stating the problem first is what I'm looking to do in this example. So company X has multiple independent brands under their parent organization, which I think is a common thing for a lot of companies as they expand out, that there's the parent organization and then these independent companies that operate under them. However, they all have to meet the same legal requirements or different requirements of the parent company. And then if I scroll down here
Mhm.
a bit, so oftentimes what we see when we think of expanding out from there, from this one site or one product to multiple, is there's places where this content that is on, say, the initial site that was there or from the parent site is going to be reused in these independent sites. But the issue is, or the challenge that is often faced, is the way this content is used or how it is presented might be very different from site to site. So the content itself is the same, the data is the same, but the presentation layer might be very different.
Exactly. Exactly. Let's and just to kind of color that with a specific example, um, we could. Well, actually even before I do that, I know you're talking about this relationship between a company and multiple companies, but I think that the important thing is more so, maybe there's one main property and
Mhm.
then there are multiple others that might spin off of it. So another example that would kind of fit this scenario is I'm still just one company and I have my main website, but I'm
Mhm.
going to spin off individual focused campaign sites that are going to live on their own, but maybe they need to reuse some content from the main site. And so as an example, I worked on a product once where there was one main big website, and the website was mostly just this content machine of blog posts and videos and podcasts and stuff like that. And then they would have different initiatives that they would try. And so they'd spin up a new site, and that new site might want to pull posts from the main site. And it might not even actually display the post detail page on that site. It might just have a link that goes back to the primary property where the blog post exists, or maybe they've duplicated it and canonicalized it in whatever case. But to your point, the last thing you said is that content we want to have a source of truth for that one blog post, even though it's displayed in two different places, but that campaign site might have its very own specific brand, just like an independent brand or independent company underneath a parent company might have its own look and feel. And so the same content might need to appear visually in two different places. So that's just trying to take the problem that you've started with and add a little bit of detail to that.
I like that. I like that last sentence, especially. You said same content might need to appear uh, visually in multiple places. Might need to appear
Yeah, visually distinct. Yeah, something like that.
distinct in multiple places. Yeah. Actually, you know what is kind of, without giving too much away, before we, without putting the carriage before, I'm really bad with these little sayings, but without putting the carriage before the horse or the horse for the carriage, one thing that your example made me think of is what we've just been thinking about right now for what we're doing at Stackbit. We have Stackbit, we have Stackbit's blog, we have the Stackbit site, let's say, and we're in just ideation stage at this point. However it will evolve, but we're talking a little bit about a separate site that will hold a lot of content. And maybe to kind of reinforce your point, so an example of this could be, say there is, content from the blog that lives in Stackbit that we might want to also include in this separate site that we're thinking of. Would this be another example?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And another case where those are going to be visually distinct. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. All right. When kind of going back to this, and also too, I want to talk about the structure of a blog post and your advice or insight on that, because I'll pause, I'll take a step back maybe on the examples, and I'll walk you through what I currently have as far as structure goes, and maybe get some of your feedback on that. Does that sound like a good next step?
Great. Yeah. Let's do it.
Okay, perfect. It's not as long as it seems, it's just really zoomed in, I promise. um So what I started with was I broke down the blog post into kind of sections, meaning I included different. I like when I'm going through a blog post and I can see the next part. Look ahead, like for example, how do we solve this? So I know this part will be talking about the solution for the problem that was listed or spoken about ahead of time. And I started with, okay, so let me take a step back. I started with the problem that people face, going into um, talking about supporting multiple front ends in a single source has its advantages, and kind of high level as to the disadvantages, and leading up to the problem, which I cover in here. Then I go into why do we solve this. Then I structure in where the missing link, which in this case is Stackbit, comes in. And then I go into an example of how to architect your site in this way. What do you think of that flow? Does that make sense?
I think typically it's a good way to position a blog post. I think that, the problem solution elaboration is it's generally a good flow. This is getting into the weeds a bit, but a trick also is not a trick, but telling people what they're going to get out of the post right away. Kind of a TLDR sort of thing can be really helpful. But so we can kind of talk about stylistically how we can button it up near the end. And in fact, usually what I would do in working through a post with someone would be say, all right, we don't have to worry about that right now, and we don't have to worry about headings right now. Let's just write the story first, and then we'll come back and we'll add the headings. Because yes, like you said, I want headings, I want short paragraphs. I basically, as a reader, I try to write for the reader generally. So I think about, okay, well, I'm writing this because I want somebody to read it. So if I don't want to read it, or, but then it's not important. But also, if I but not just if I don't want to read it, but how would I read it?
Mm,
And how would I skim through this and for me personally, if I look at a blog post, the first thing I'm usually doing is I'm scrolling all the way through and I'm like, okay, what is this about? And
mhm.
then is it worth my time to stay on here? Or am I just going to kind of pick a few things, read it, and then move on? And either of those might be okay. Anyways,
Yeah, that's
um,
very interesting, and it's so true. I think that's how I operate as well. I don't just, open up a blog post and start reading from the first sentence till the end. You kind of assess it at first. You see, okay, is this something that's going to be useful or helpful? You kind of judge it in a way before you dive into it.
oh, 100%. Yes, yes. And so I mean, the structural presentation is almost as important as the actual content for sure.
Super
But
interesting.
that's something that you can clean up near the end. You got to get the guts right first. And so back to that question, is the flow right? I think it could work. I also think that this in this particular case,
Hmm.
if you start with the problem, which
Hmm.
is a um the yeah, thinking about the best way to word this. This problem is, it's not that it's unique, but it is somewhat it's somewhat advanced to understand even just the problem.
Hmm.
And so if you start immediately with the problem, then you've basically taken the reading level up a
Yeah.
notch, because you say, okay, well, you have to be here to understand what I'm talking about. And that can be a really hard thing in crafting a post, because you don't want to start from zero every time, otherwise you'll never finish your post. You're teaching everybody everything. In this particular case, the way I thought it could be interesting to get started was basically to take somebody in a few short steps to getting to the to getting to the problem. And I haven't read this, so you might be doing it, but the way I was thinking about the intro is not just like, hey, you're already in this place where you've got a bunch of content that you're reusing everywhere. But
Yes.
you can like really quickly think about, consider the scale of yeah, what's a quick background? Like, okay, how does this challenge actually come about? And
Ah.
here are some bullet points. If I think about,
Yeah.
how do I actually get to the problem? Because the problem's only a problem once you've built a fairly complex network of websites. So
Mm.
how I get to the problem? Well, first I've decided that I need to use the content management system to host my content, and I'm using a modern architecture, so I'm going to yeah, I think it's that. It's like, okay, I've separated my code from my content, and my
Mhm.
content now lives in a content management system. Boom. Step one.
Yeah.
Um, Step two is I need to I need the same content to serve multiple websites.
Mhm.
And this is where the idea of headless really becomes valuable, because headless promotes this omni-channel approach, or this having a source of truth for your content. And so at number two, this is where, if you're using something like traditional WordPress, you
Mhm.
just spin up a new site and you duplicate that content.
Mhm.
And you do that long enough, and that very, very clearly feels like the wrong thing to do.
Yeah.
So then you move to the headless approach, and the omni-channel approach,
Yeah.
and you say, this sounds really, really powerful in theory. And I remember going through this with that example site I told you about. We're like, yes, you can have all these sites and you can put all this stuff into one CMS and it'll serve them all. And it sounds very powerful, and it is very powerful in theory. So, okay, so there you there in your 2 or 3 steps.
Mhm.
Now you're at the baseline of,
Mhm.
I think, where the problem comes in.
You've really brought
And
oh,
yes.
sorry, I was just gonna say we kind of brought the reader along too, because I think, like you said earlier on, this is something that it's difficult if you just start right with the problem without leading someone to really understanding and feeling that pain. Um, so it makes sense why we're, starting with at the point of, okay, you just want to use a content management system.
Yeah, and I mean, you you touched on something in that you have to engage, or you have to, yeah, you have to catch someone's attention in that first paragraph anyway. So it's like, okay, that's what you want to explain in your lead up to the problem. It doesn't necessarily mean that's the first sentence. You could kind of do this in like a storytelling sort of way, where you're like, here's the problem, I'm catching your attention, and then you can back up and say, here's how you got here.
Hmm.
That sort of thing. I don't know, again, can play with the specifics there, but that gets us to the problem. So, okay, now tell me how you're explaining the problem here in the intro.
Let's go down a little bit. Okay, so for the intro right now, I would say the problem kind of starts uh, talking about it here. So while the content used in these sites may be similar, or I guess it would be even maybe the same, I could reword that. Uh, well, the content is reused in some of these sites. Anyways, I won't get hung up on that. How it is styled and designed is usually different for each site. As a result, it doesn't make sense to store the content in the code. To solve this problem, companies typically use a headless CMS. So I'm still kind of working just in different order.
Hmm, hmm.
This approach is effective, but as the websites continue to grow and scale, reusing the content becomes costly, especially if the content is tied to the presentation layer. In such cases, creating new content every time becomes necessary. Oh, sorry. In such cases, creating new content every time becomes necessary, which can add up quickly. Wow, when you read actually what you wrote out loud, that is a different ballgame.
It's yeah, yes, yes. I used to do this every time before I would publish. I'd read it out loud and be like, well, that isn't right.
No, yeah, and I'm not actually, you know what? I'm not really I don't feel like this paragraph is really honing in on the specific problem. I'm just kind of going for, yeah, it's costly if you keep on reusing this content in multiple places. Um, Especially when it's tied to the presentation layer, then you have to, uh, make a new space for that content you want to reuse, or um, a new organization in your headless CMS to use that content again. And as we've seen, and as you sent me a link to an article recently, the cost for storing that content as it expands it just continues to go up. But I'm not really honing in a very one or two sentence way of the bigger pain point I feel. I don't know if that makes sense.
It it does make sense. And I think if we go back up to what is number 3 there,
Yeah.
one of the challenges, as we were talking with Joe yesterday, one of the challenges is that we're actually talking about 2 different but related problems. And I think what we should first, let's talk about those 2 problems, and
Mhm.
then need to decide, can you cover both of those with a
Mm,
story, or is it more compelling to basically write 2 slightly different versions of a similar article that are ultra hyper focused on each particular scenario? Go ahead.
I was gonna say, I feel okay. So for those two problems, I feel like we have spoken about one of them quite like throughout this conversation, which is essentially that you want to, or maybe there's two problems within this. But okay, sorry, let me finish my thought. The one problem being that you have this content you want to reuse across multiple websites, but it's tied to the presentation layer, which means if you want to reuse it, you have to essentially um, store it again. I don't know if that's the right term, but store it again, meaning because it's so tied to that presentation layer, you have to it's essentially just duplicating over and over again. That's is that would you say that's problem number one?
Sort of. Yes. Yes. So the presentation piece,
Yeah.
and I think this probably makes sense with examples. And so definitely that's another thing to consider here is the more examples we can pump in here, the better. But let's go back to my blog post example because that is we'll just play with okay. So let's play with this example of I have a main website and it is a content machine and it puts out all sorts of different types of media and content. And then I've got these different focused sites that are going to have some unique content. Like they're going to have some unique landing pages
Mhm.
that organize content in a different way, but all the content that they're going to use is going to come from the parent site.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's our scenario. Now, one problem with going with the single space omni-channel approach
Mhm.
for that scenario is that like you've said this already, and this is what you're hinting at. One, the content, some content is
Mhm.
the same. So I have, let's just say, blog posts in my main site,
Mhm.
and I want to show those blog posts in another campaign site.
Mhm.
But how I display those, I want to be visually interesting or visually different.
Mhm.
Now, if that is a global setting for that site,
Yes.
then this is not as big of a deal. You just say, well, I don't include any of that information in the in the CMS, right? Like I'm just going to have that's all going to be hard coded in.
Yeah.
But if you want a user to control that, like for example, let's say that posts are displayed as a card, okay?
Yes.
And that there are 3 different variations of cards that you can use on the main website. And
Mhm.
there are maybe 2 other unique and different variations of card that you can use on the campaign site. Well, then in that case, you have this decision to make on your content. It's like, well, your content is already in this one place, but now how do you determine which card style you're going to use
Mhm.
in each given place? And you can go really deep because there are several different architectural and content modeling patterns to solving that problem, in keeping with the omni-channel approach. But that's basically problem number one. And so you can go really deep on that. That's problem number one. Problem number two is that there might be content itself that is unique
Yeah.
between the main site and these campaign sites. So that, let's say, I'm going to let all the content is driven by what we see in the CMS. So in the main site, maybe I have what I'm saying. Okay, you're letting folks compose pages of components within the CMS. Well, your homepage for your main site and your homepage for your campaign site are very specific to those two sites. And so if you have say a landing page model in your CMS, well, now you have and you're responsible for managing the main property. Well, now you have also all these other things that look like they're pages that should be built on the main site, but they're not actually for that site. They're for this other site. So both of these problems are basically feeding up into what you started with, which was I've got that main site, I have subsite. We have to figure out how to model content for both. And the solution that we ultimately get to in both cases is you should put all the shared stuff in one place and then all the specific stuff in a unique place. And hey, Stackbit makes this super easy because it actually doesn't matter where things come from, but that if you're going directly to that source, it can make a lot more sense.
Yeah.
Um,
And
the
then
problem in there, yeah. Oh, sorry, real quick. The
yes.
the problem that I'm struggling with here is that the beginning and the end are basically the same in both cases, but then the details that you add to how different ways that you might try to solve that problem are different based on the context of the problem that you're actually choosing. And that's why it's like I don't know that we want to pick both for one particular post.
Both. It makes sense to separate them, yeah. And then kind of going back to one of the things that I mean, without Stackbit, this is structuring your content in this way is okay, sorry, how do I phrase this? Without Stackbit as the link between this, like you're structuring your content in a way where the reusable content is stored in a headless CMS, and then in a different file system, your presentation layer is stored, right? So that's possible without Stackbit, but where Stackbit becomes essential in solving this problem is because if you structure your content that way, great, it makes more sense from a architectural standpoint, but for your content editors and marketers, it's a huge headache because they don't have one place that they can come in and make these changes. Especially when I think this would be even more of a headache than structuring your content like this without Stackbit, I think would make more of a headache than if you were just to leave it initially where your marketers can go into the CMS and work versus, do you know what I'm trying to say? I'm going in circles now.
Yeah, no, yes, and actually, that's exactly what we did to solve that problem for this particular project. That we were paying for Contentful. I don't know if it was the enterprise amount, but it was hundreds of dollars a month,
Mhm.
and there was so much content that opening up a new space to handle this differently, one, without a stack bit, super confusing for
Yeah.
people, and two, it's expensive. We're adding more cost. So what we ended up doing, and this is something that I would probably mention here in the body, is that we then say, okay, well, how do we get creative with content modeling?
Mhm.
And what we did was we basically had this field that would get applied to entries in Contentful that would say, where is this thing being published? And so if you wanted it sent to the main site or you wanted it visible on other campaign sites, you would go to this field and there were a bunch of check boxes and you'd have to like check the boxes where it should get deployed. And
Wow.
then it's just like, and then there are all these other problems that we don't have to talk about here. Like, okay, but then when you save that, you also had to account for the main site takes longer to build than the campaign site. And so if that looks like it's available on the campaign site first, but the main site hasn't built yet, then how that page doesn't exist. And so have to have like all this deployment orchestration as well. So um yeah, it's like, yeah, you can solve this with one CMS, but you are every time you add some capability or a new campaign site or anything like that, or some visual control or something, it's like, yeah, you can shove all that into one place. Every time you make a new addition to that, you're complicating life for content editors significantly.
Ah, and so much more, you're opening up so much more room for error too.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
That's a really, I like that, that example because it's a really good visual as well. Like, I feel like I was visualizing as you were speaking about it. For next steps for this article, maybe I will focus kind of what we've been speaking about, focusing on one or the other problem versus trying to solve two problems in one post. That seems to be the way to
Mhm.
go, don't you think?
Mhm. I think so, and I think that this is potentially pivoting from where you were thinking, but I
Mhm.
personally think it might be easier to write the second post first because it's a little bit more it's a little bit more concrete. Like, uh, what am I thinking of? That y I think it's just a little easier to understand, and there are fewer I don't know if there are fewer holes to poke into it, but the examples are probably a little bit easier to grasp and a little bit more, I think it happens more frequently, and, and that the reason and so that case again is like, I've got these composable pages, and
Mhm.
I have a bunch of shared objects that I wanna add to these composable pages, but do I really want to have all of those pages in one CMS when each page is unique to some specific front end? And the thing is, if you this happens and we get in this scenario where we just shove everything into a single CMS because the advantages to omnichannel and API headless CMS is huge. And
Yeah.
so we often make sacrifices like dealing with this because of the benefit we get from being able to serve this content. It's like, okay, I'll deal with having to look through all of these pages that have nothing to do with my website
Yeah.
because now I don't have to duplicate posts on
Yeah.
multiple sites. Like, okay, great. That makes a ton of sense. And I can't really, without some other tool to help, I can't really break up these pages into individual content sources and then have another one that's shared because one, that is extra confusing to content editors because they have to know where to go to get the content. And two, and I don't quote me on this, we'd have to research it, but I would say that most CMSs won't let you reference objects in some other space from it. If it's like my pages are over here for this site and here's this shared space that I can't reference necessarily.
Yeah, that's true.
And so that's when the story, like the outcome here is that Stackbit, this is an amazing problem that Stackbit makes super simple because you just put everything where it should go
Mhm.
and then you can bring it all into Stackbit and you can cross link things as well, which is super powerful. And the editors don't actually have to know or care where anything is because they just do everything through Stackbit. And that seems like it's going to be easier to tell that story first
Yeah.
because it's more concrete and then come back to, because then you could also use this as kind of a background to write the presentation post, which is like it's way more nuanced, I think.
I agree. I like this. I feel good about that. And especially too, because once this one is written and in a good place, then as you just mentioned, it's kind of setting it up for the second post. And then even too, then all these the story from the first one and the problem you're just speaking about is in place and really well thought out. So then it makes the second one, yeah. Yeah, I like that. I like that flow a lot. It seems like it makes sense.
Cool, cool.
I'm pumped. Okay. So for next steps on this, I am going to start specking it out a bit further for the problem number two. And then I'll touch base with you later as I continue on that. I got some really good examples that you shared throughout this call too. So that's going to be super helpful as well. Do you typically, Sean, when you do, I should know this as I've seen and read a lot of your writing, but off the top of my head, when you do examples, do you kind of intertwine them through the post? I'm trying to recall.
I think it helps if you can,
Yeah.
because if someone's going to sit down and read it, you've put their mind into some specific context and they can follow that, especially if it's an example that makes sense to reuse or that you're going to build on in some way. So then it's convenient. You lessen the number of words that you have to write. I think that there are cases when you might um where a greater number of examples might help. And in this case, maybe if we could come up with 3 to 5 examples, that could be really powerful in setting up the problem, because someone could be like, "Oh, yes, I have this issue specifically," but then maybe you only go with one example to demonstrate the point and the solution.
Yeah, I like that. Okay, perfect. Yeah, and that's a good way just to get in that frame of mind when writing out the solution more so as well.
Cool, cool.
Perfect. Thank you, Sean. This has been super helpful as always, and I will talk to you soon.
All right. See you later, Tiff.